And so today we're going to study chapter 14 in Engelhardt's book, The Mission San Luis Obispo in the Valley of the Bears. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Connie Pillsbury, somebody I know very well. Connie first fell in love with the missions in the 4th grade, where they studied the missions and they went to visit San Gabriel Mission nearby. And today, during the presentation, you're going to find out who else. One of the governors was associated with San Gabriel. So listen for that. In her working with the docents, Connie's always strived to become more knowledgeable and informed about the missions and that particular era of California, and has always strived to encourage others to do the same. She's never done a PowerPoint presentation before, so we'll see how that goes. And at this time, I'd like you to welcome Connie Pillsbury, mission aficionado.
We're going to head up the screen sharing now. And here we go. All right. So I have titled this chapter 14, Power and Greed. And the reason for that is that it was a major chaotic battle between the California governors, the Mexican governors, and then all governors versus the missions. This was a turbulent time, just picking up from where Maurice left off. It's still a turbulent time, and the time we're covering in this little chapter is 1840 to 1845. So what was the setting in 1840? Well, we had two factors up here. They're all Hispanic born, but they were born in different places. The Californios were born in California, and these were the descendants of soldiers and the De Anza party. Engelhardt also calls these Californios settlers and paisanos. They had a kind of a pride of their pedigree that they had been born here and considered that they maybe were the best ones to run the place, and they didn't really want to be interfered with by Mexico anymore. They all intermarried, as you will learn from Roy Hartnell when he gives his talk. He has so many ancestors that are descendants of soldiers because they all intermarried. So our photo here is our mission, and probably kind of what it looked like about 1840. Looks like it's been fallen apart. Looks like there was a cannonball sent to one window, and that section of the mission is actually right where the parish hall is now. And I like to think of that as about 1840. The average time of governor in this state at that time, in California, was 7.9 months. That just shows you how bad the turnover rate was. And what was our population here? We don't realize it was very sparsely populated. There were only about 8,000 Hispanic born, and by that I mean they were either born in California or they were born in Mexico. They were all Spanish speaking. There were less than 100,000 Indians, and that number is subject to up or down. And there were very few white European immigrants. People like John Sutter and Jonathan Temple were among the very few that came here, maybe by ship. Maybe they came in and married a Spanish lady, learned Spanish, became a Catholic, but they were the small number. Well, during this time, 1840 to 45, millions of acres of mission land were distributed by the governors, millions. And that's sort of what's happening. The land is being distributed. The governors are arguing. The missions are in disrepair. The buildings are in ruin. Barely 100 Indians remained at our mission, San Luis Obispo. And here we have in our picture who I imagine could be our dear father, Ramon Abella. He is the last Franciscan at the mission, suffered through great sufferings at this time. He was already in his 70s, there alone during all this turbulence. Let's learn a little bit more about him. So our father Abella was actually the longest serving Franciscan. He served in the missions for 44 years, originally starting in 1798 at San Francisco. He started at our mission in 1834. By the time he came here, he'd already served many years in Carmel, In San Francisco, he'd gone on journeys to the Central Valley, met a lot of different Native American groups, and kept extensive diaries. And some have described him as the most successful and the most long-lasting, loyal Franciscan. So he was here in his elderly years in this time of chaos. Father Engelhardt explains what his situation was at our mission. The friar was bedded on an ox hide, and for nourishment had only strips of dried meat in the sun, meat dried in the sun. He bears without murmuring his old age, his privations and humiliations which poverty entails. Now imagine him, he's in his 70s. There's no money and very little land left. There's not any food really coming in. And yet he said that he wanted to die at his post. The bishop had offered him more comfortable surroundings, but he said, no, I'm going to work till the end. In 1840, we got the first bishop of the Californias. Now, what does that mean? We still had Father Duran, who was the presidente of the Franciscan missions, but we brought in a bishop, Mexican born, from the Zapoteca Franciscan, and he came up to run all the missions in the Californias. Now, he got to Santa Barbara, where Father Duran was in charge of the housing arrangements. And Father Duran, being an authentic original Franciscan, felt that these Mexican Zapotecas were sort of second-class Franciscans, and he didn't really like this guy coming up here. So he assigned him to a windowless, damp, the worst room at the mission, just as a way of expressing his feelings about him. Well, Father Duran did turn the missions over to Francisco Garcia Diego, and he served until his death, which was 1846. So he was also in his late years. Another secular priest came in with him, Reverend Jose Miguel Gomez, who came up from Mexico. Now, Gomez is important in our story because he was actually the next missionary to take over San Luis Obispo, because Father Abela retired in 1841 because of his ill health and went down to Purísima, and then actually died the very next year at Santa Ynez, where he's buried. So Francisco Garcia, Jose Miguel Gomez, as a priest, and ordained him, and he came to San Luis Obispo in 1842. Same situation as Abela, miserable, no food, everything falling apart, very few neophytes, lots of pressure from the governors. And although Engelhardt in his book says that Gomez was transferred to Purísima in 1844, at a later point, he quotes letters from Gomez from San Luis Obispo. So I'm guessing that he stayed there through 1846 and maybe longer. The picture shows Mexican priests in their habit. There are no pictures or stories online about Jose Miguel Gomez except some famous baseball players. And so he's a minor character, but he's important for our San Luis Obispo because he was here tending it on its last legs. Okay, now let's talk about the other side. This is the governor side. The first governor that appears during our period is Governor Juan Bautista Alvarado. Now, he was California born, actually born at Mission San Gabriel, and his grandfather accompanied Portola. So if you think about these Californios, these are all the grandchildren of the original soldiers that were born here, and their parents were born here. So they are feeling very territorial, that this is our home, this is our place. Well, there was a Mexican appointed governor, Gutierrez, and Alvarado and his brother-in-law, Jose Castro, did not like what Gutierrez was doing, so they had an uprising in 1836, and they kicked Gutierrez out. And that was called an independence movement. And in that independence movement, they even developed a flag and made himself president and decided that this was their new country run by them with their own flag. Well, Mexico somehow worked with him and convinced him that he could have more autonomy. They would leave him alone if he would abandon his independence movement and that they would let him be governor. So they appointed him governor. This is a Californio. That means that they did not have any interest in the missions or the neophytes keeping any land because they wanted it. They deserved it. They were born there. He did write a letter that Engelhardt quotes in 1842, directing that the land be divided for the Indians. But of course, that never happened. Engelhardt calls Alvarado's term, I love it, a reign of plunder to the Franciscan fathers. Well, again, Mexico did not like how Alvarado was running the state. And so they sent Governor Brigadier General Manuel Micheltorena to replace him, to forcibly replace him. Micheltorena was of Basque heritage. He'd been a general in their various wars, and it was Santa Anna that sent him up. And he was definitely a military man. He brought with him 300 soldiers, according to one source, and they came up to Los Angeles. Well, there were only about 275 people in the Pueblo of Los Angeles at that time, very little food, and these soldiers sort of rampaged the landscape, went to the rancheros, broke into the homes, stole the crops, stole the horses. They caused terrible problems and really incurred the wrath of the Californios. And even they said the women were afraid to go outside because of these soldiers. So right off the bat, the Californios did not like General Manuel Micheltorena. The next year, after spending the summer in Los Angeles, he did go up to Monterey and start being active as governor. Now, what Micheltorena did do, remember, he is a colleague of Bishop Garcia Diego. They're both from Mexico City. They're both from Mexico. They probably met. Garcia Diego convinced him, or maybe helped him decide, to issue a land grant to the mission, to Bishop Garcia Diego, of 4,000 acres down at the La Laguna, right around the lake there, where the neophytes and the mission already had their gardens, horses, cattle, housing. It was basically the agricultural area of the mission at this point. So that land grant is actually recorded in the land grant records. We found it. And this was really the last piece of land that the mission had for agricultural use because Santa Margarita was gone. The land was for the use of the neophytes who lived down there and tended the crops and the cattle, and for food for our Reverend Miguel Gomez. Bishop Garcia is recorded as sending a nice letter to Micheltorena, always using the words, Your Excellency, very polite. I have received your communication and give due thanks for the offer of the dwelling, the garden, the vineyard, and a small piece of land for cultivating for Reverend Miguel Gomez. Now, at the end of his letter that Engelhardt quotes, he says, Permit me, however, to assure you that I do not count much upon the settlers. That's the paisanos, that's the Californios, that's Alvarado and Castro and the Vallejos and the gang. Garcia Diego had been there long enough to realize that the Californios didn't want any land to be granted back to the missions or to the neophytes. So he gives his warning here, thanks for the land, but I'm not sure this is going to stick, but we do appreciate it. A year later, after Micheltorena had been in Monterey as governor, he does an important change in the status of the mission. I don't know exactly why, except that in the front of his statutes, he says, since San Luis Obispo possesses no property whatever, and that means money or land, and only a small number of aged neophytes, I have resolved the following. So he makes this regulation, and it's printed and sent out to San Luis Obispo and around the state, that our mission is now raised to the rank of a pueblo. It gets to keep its uncultivated lands near the mission. Well, that means the mission is no longer really a mission, it's now the town center. And second point was that the neophytes would be entirely free, except that each week, 6 different ones would serve the priest once a week, sort of like leading a docent tour. Anyway, and also they would be given their food and their clothing. They would also get a small stipend for their work. The priest residence, which is our current museum, would now be a parish house, which meant it was available for use by the community. There would be rooms for schools and for the justices, for the jail, government use. And you can imagine in that rough era that around the corner there were hangings and wild things going on right out. And then there was the jail and the Justice of the Peace office. That was quite a busy corner. The Justice of the Peace was subject to the governor in Monterey because in Micheltoreno's regulations, he said, since the area basically doesn't seem to be able to live in a civil manner or manage itself, in other words, this is a wild, out of control place, your Justice of the Peace that I appoint is going to be subject to me, and I'm going to make the final decisions. But that Justice of the Peace is always also going to be in charge of the Indian work, making sure everything is taken care of. The governor wanted to control the development of this pueblo. So he said that he needed to approve ground for any house to keep the streets symmetrical. So if you wanted to build a house down there around the mission, you had to send your plans and get approval from Governor Micheltorena. This is an interesting one, that the lands occupied by Indians cannot be sold, but will return to Mexico upon their death or the death of their heirs. Isn't that sad that here's their one chance to have home ownership, but if they die or their heirs abandon them, they go back to the nation, which is the nation of Mexico. As always, the Indians are on the short stick of all of these governors' regulations. The emancipated Indians will be paid to do the repair work. So basically, he's giving the land back to the missions. He's putting it under the control of the priest there, and the priest would work with the Justice of the Peace and try to keep the mission going. Bishop Garcia Diego was very, very happy about that too. But the Californios were not happy at all about that. Engelhardt wrote, the results of the Micheltorena order. Unfortunately for restoring the missions and the neophytes to the care of the missionaries, Micheltorena incurred the wrath of the unscrupulous paisano, that's the Californios chief. Again, that's Alvarado, Castro, Vallejo, etc. Well, Alvarado didn't like that regulations, and so he and his brother-in-law, Jose Castro, who, by the way, they were married into the Vallejo family, in 1845, announced that they were revolting against Micheltorena, and they found a rancho named Providencia around the Cahuenga Pass, where the owner of it was willing to let the battle be there. And that would be between the settlers. The settlers are the Californios, and between the Mexican forces under Micheltorena. This 2-day battle lasted a very short time with few casualties because it seems that the guys they hired to fight it kind of lost interest and said, why are we doing this battle for these feuding governors? And they kind of laid down their arms and said, we're just not going to fight this battle. But in the end, Alvarado did defeat Micheltorena, and now General Brigadier Micheltorena is banished back to Mexico in March 1845. So the revolving door swerves again, and back goes Micheltorena to Mexico. You can see Castro, and there actually is a marker where this Battle of Coenga took place. I'd never heard of it before. Micheltorena is gone, so we've got to find another Californio to be the governor. Alvarado didn't want to be governor again, so they chose as a temporary governor Pio Pico. Now, Pio Pico is California born, and he's an interesting mix of African, Native American, and Spanish. And he had already been governor in 1832, so he was well seasoned, knew his in and outs of Monterey. He got in 1845, right after they kicked out Micheltorena, and he began his war on the missions. He started doling out land grants like they were cookies at the office. And in 1 year, gave out 65 land grants, big land grants. If you look on the Ranchos of California website, it lists all the land grants, who they were from and who they were to. Well, many of the names of the grants that were to also had the last name Pico or Andre. He granted some to Alvarado, to Carrillo, everybody that his first cousin and last got a piece of land. But he also granted the missions land that had been given to Garcia Diego by Micheltorena right out from under the bishop and granted it to John Wilson. Engelhardt definitely did not think much of Pio Pico. Almost immediately, Pico began his war on the missions and did not desist until he'd wiped them out. Pretty strong language, isn't it? San Luis Obispo, with the little land granted by Micheltorena, that was the 4,000 acres, would not escape the rapacity of unscrupulous greed. Don't you love those words? The rapacity of unscrupulous greed. Oh, I could just see Engelhardt getting these words on paper. So Pico was absolutely determined to end the mission era. This really upset Bishop Francisco Garcia Diego. He wrote a polite, but underneath the writing, you could tell how disappointed and angry he was, but he was very polite. And in his letter, which is in Engelhardt, buried in that small font, he says, you know, the titles of the missions are in my possession. They're registered. They're in Monterey on page 9 of the government document. And I think you've made a mistake. And I'm sure that you would be willing to suspend the grant because this is the land that has already been given to us. And it's necessary to respect the sacred mission property. And this is the sacred laws of the Spanish and Mexican church. And I thank you in advance for the fact that you're going to suspend the execution of the grant. Now, at the same time, Gomez, our priest, 2 days before this letter, he also wrote a short letter. His was a little more graphic. He said to Pio Pico, you have sold the land that rightfully belongs to their neophytes and their families. You've sold it to the Mexicans for whiskey and an old Indian blanket. Which is how, just about how they felt. For a pittance, you granted this land out. Well, Engelhardt tells us what happened. This letter that Francisco Garcia Diego wrote was in September of 1845. Engelhardt writes, the bishop might have saved his ink and paper, for only 3 months later, December 4th, 1845, Pio Pico announced that he had sold at public auction to Scott, Wilson, and McKinley the mission of San Luis Obispo for $510. Now, in Engelhardt's books, it says 500, but we have the deed and we know it's 510, so I put the right number in there. So might have saved his ink and paper. So let's take a look at these grants to further understand what was going on. The number of Spanish and Mexican grants and acreage distributed during this period was between 491 and 500, and some estimate even up to 800. The millions of acres of mission land that were distributed was 8.92 million. Remember, the mission lands only went to the coastal hills from San Diego to Sonoma. So this was all the coast of California, 8.92 million acres. What did our governors do? Alvarado, Micheltorena, and Pico. They gave out, as you see there, just between 1837 and 46, 164 for Alvarado, 115 and 79 for Pico. Pico was only there for 1 year. A total of 6.7 million acres of land, which was, and those three governors gave out 3/4 of the state's total grant acreage. So in their period, they gave out the most grants of any of all of the governors. And in San Luis Obispo, it's even more interesting. Alvarado gave 22 grants in San Luis Obispo, 333,000 acres. Micheltorena gave 6, and Pico gave 4, but he gave 4 very important ones, totaling 119,000 acres. Pico's grants went to Wilson and Scott, the top one, and that's a little 3,000 acres at El Chorro. And then he gave Asuncion, where I live, 40,000, which was Santa Margarita and all the cattle company of the mission, 40,000 acres to Estrada. And you'll see the site of the Estrada Adobe when you come up here in April. But then the biggie, Cañada de los Osos y Pecho y Isle, Irish Hills, Los Osos Valley, Montana de Oro State Park, Diablo Canyon Power Plant, 32,000 acres to Scott and John Wilson. And that's what really made Garcia Diego mad, gave it right out from under the church. He also gave the Way Purísima to Jonathan Temple, 14,000, and another small one to the Carrillos. Remember that name, the Carrillos, of 4,000 acres? He was busy. Did he know the end was coming? Did he know because of the Texas revolt that Mexican California was soon to be gone? Who knows? But he gave it away as fast as he could and in big chunks. Here's the grant, the deed. The egregious part of the selling of the actual 1 acre mission lot, 1 acre, to Wilson, Scott, and McKinley is that he sold it for money. The grants were just given to people and they had to prove out. But this, he accepted money like he was auctioning off a cattle or some farm equipment. It was such a slap in the face. He sold it at an auction without even telling the bishop, and then announced later, oh, by the way, I just sold your bedroom and your kitchen and the place where Reverend Gomez lives. This was sort of the final last straw in the humiliation of the missions to sell the mission itself on its 1 acre right out from under the bishop and the reverend. So Engelhardt closes with some pretty strong comments. Nowhere as at San Luis Obispo, except Mission Purísima, which, by the way, he also auctioned for $1,100, does the impiety, unscrupulousness, and injustice of Pio Pico appear so flagrant. Grants made to secular people were held inviolable, and Pico would never have dared to dispose of any man's, that's any normal citizen man's property. The land granted to the church by laws of Spain and Mexico, and I shortened this, was held sacred even in the eyes of the pagans. They knew that was godly, holy property. But In Pico's eyes, it was no man's land, and therefore at his disposal for any purpose. Strong words. So as we come to the end, and in closing here, on your left, you see the bad guys. Alvarado, Mitchell, Castro, Pico. These are the governors. These are the bad governors that fought the bishops and the priests. But the bad governors also were busy fighting each other, the bad governors against the other bad governors. And like I said, it was a revolving door in Monterey, in and out. So quickly, you hardly got the guy's name before he was ousted. And on the right, we see our Abella and Diego Garcia and Jose Miguel Gomez. And think what these priests went through during this time. Basically, the missions were stripped out and their privations, their way to have any food or even get any supplies was gone. The neophytes were leaving, a very few around, and they were elderly. There had been a lot of death. And of all the people that suffered most of all was the neophytes. They were the ones on the very short end of the stick. They didn't end up with any land and any property. They didn't really end up with any material goods at all. They were scattered, and in the eyes of the Californios, they were basically invisible. So we have a low point that we've reached here at the mission about 1845. And I like to see Father Abuela there, standing there thinking about whatever has become of my mission. And I think Father Zephyrin Engelhardt felt the same way as he's looking at his books. And Father Engelhardt, probably all you know about him is that we have our little book. Father Engelhardt did close chapter 14 with an upbeat note. After all this bad news and all this chaos and tumultuousness, he wrote, "The United States government emphatically declared otherwise, as will appear in chapter 16. So little did Pico or the bishops know that after Mission San Luis Obispo was sold in December of 1845, it was only going to be 4 months until April of 1846 when the Mexican-American War broke out. And that was going to be the end of all of this chaos. So this is a happy note that denote that in the future we know, but at that point in 1845, they didn't know the future. I'm going to show you a little bit about Engelhardt. Here he is examining his many, many books, which are in the Mission Archive Library. And his title is the Dean of the California Mission Historians. And he had the honor of being buried in the Friars Crypt in Santa Barbara's Cemeterio. He was 83, and he served, in a way, he reminds me a little bit of Abella, because both of these men served the mission until their very last days as Franciscans. Next week, Dan is going to finish out the book for us. He's going to take us through what happens after this, from chapter 16 to the end, and kind of sum up everything you've learned through this. And I'm sure that he'll correct all the things that any of us said that may have not been correct, because he says he has some things for us. So I want to thank you very much for coming tonight, and look forward to seeing you next week, which will be our final meeting on our continuing education series. So all of you, happy Groundhog Day and have a great evening.